I never meant to be the kind of wife who goes through her husband's things. Trust had always been the foundation of my marriage to Anthony, or at least I thought it was. But there I was, sitting cross-legged on the dusty attic floor of our Meridian home, holding a leather-bound diary that would shatter everything I believed about my life. The afternoon sun streamed through the small window, casting long shadows across the cardboard boxes I'd been packing for our upcoming move. We were finally downsizing after 32 years in this house, and I'd volunteered to tackle the attic while Anthony was at his Saturday golf game. It was supposed to be a simple task: sort through old memories, keep the treasures, donate the rest. The diary had been hidden beneath a stack of yellowed letters wrapped in what looked like an old pillowcase. My fingers traced the worn leather cover, and I could feel my heart beginning to race even before I opened it. Something about the way it had been concealed, so deliberately tucked away, made my stomach clench with an inexplicable dread. Anthony had always been meticulous about his belongings, but I'd never known him to keep a diary. The leather was soft with age, the kind that comes from years of handling, and there was a small brass clasp that had tarnished to a dull green. I told myself I should put it back, that whatever was inside wasn't meant for my eyes. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and after 3 decades of marriage, I felt I had the right to know what my husband had been hiding in our own home. My hands trembled as I undid the clasp, the small click echoing in the silent attic like a gunshot. The first page was dated 15 years ago, written in Anthony's familiar handwriting, the same careful script I'd seen on birthday cards and grocery lists for decades. But the words that greeted me were nothing like the loving messages I was used to. "My secret son is with your sister," the first line read, and I felt the world tilt beneath me. I read it again, certain I'd misunderstood, but the words remained the same, stark and devastating in their simplicity. My vision blurred, and I had to grip the diary with both hands to keep from dropping it. The attic suddenly felt suffocating, the air thick and heavy, as if the very walls were pressing in on me. I forced myself to keep reading, each word feeling like a physical blow. "Emma doesn't know that I know the truth about little Marcus," the entry continued. "She thinks she's protecting everyone by calling him her adopted son. But I see my own eyes looking back at me every time I'm around that boy. The guilt is eating me alive, but I can't bring myself to tell Laura. How do you tell the woman you love that you've betrayed her with her own sister? How do you explain that the nephew she adores is actually your biological son?" The diary slipped from my numb fingers, landing with a soft thud on the dusty floorboards. Marcus, my sister Emma's adopted son, the boy I'd helped raise, the child I'd bought Christmas presents for and taken to baseball games. The sweet, dark-haired boy who had Anthony's stubborn cowlick and his habit of drumming his fingers when he was thinking. The memories came flooding back with sickening clarity. How Emma had suddenly announced her decision to adopt a baby 15 years ago. How she'd been so secretive about the adoption process. How she'd moved to the other side of Meridian right around the time Marcus was born. I remembered thinking it was strange that she'd never let us meet the birth mother, never shared any details about the adoption agency. But I'd been so happy for her, so proud of her decision to give a child a loving home, that I'd never questioned the inconsistencies. Now, sitting in that dusty attic with my world crumbling around me, every strange detail suddenly made perfect, horrible sense. The way Anthony always seemed so invested in Marcus's school performances, how he'd insist on attending every birthday party, how his face would light up whenever Emma brought the boy around. I picked up the diary with shaking hands, desperate to understand how this nightmare had become my reality. The next entry was dated a week later, and Anthony's handwriting looked more frantic, less controlled. "I saw Marcus at the grocery store today with Emma. He's getting so tall, and he has my mother's smile. Laura was with me, and she commented on how much he's grown. I wanted to tell her right then and there, he's grown because he's my son, because he has my genes running through his veins. But I'm a coward. I've been a coward for 15 years, and I don't know how to stop being one now." Emma and I agreed that this secret would die with us, but it's killing me slowly, day by day. Every family gathering is torture. Watching Laura dote on a child who should have been ours, if only I hadn't been so weak, so selfish. The attic felt like it was spinning around me, and I had to close my eyes to steady myself. 15 years of lies, 15 years of family dinners and holidays, where I'd been the only one who didn't know the truth. I thought about all the times I'd wondered why Anthony and Emma seemed to have such an easy relationship, why they always seemed to share private jokes and meaningful glances. I'd attributed it to them both being naturally charismatic people, never imagining that their connection ran so much deeper and darker than I could have ever conceived. The betrayal cut through me like a knife, sharp and clean and devastating. It wasn't just Anthony who had lied to me. It was Emma too, my own sister, the person I'd trusted with my deepest secrets and fears. They had both looked me in the eye, year after year, and chosen to keep living this elaborate deception. I sat there in the gathering dusk, clutching that diary like it was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become liquid and unstable. The house felt different now, like a place where strangers lived, where nothing was quite what it seemed. I could hear the familiar sounds of our neighborhood, children playing in the distance, a dog barking, the hum of air conditioners working against the late afternoon heat. But everything felt foreign now, like I was experiencing it all through a thick pane of glass. How do you process the fact that your entire life has been built on a foundation of lies? How do you reconcile the man you've loved for over 3 decades with the stranger who had written these words? I knew I had to keep reading, had to understand the full scope of what had been hidden from me, but I also knew that with each page I turned, I was walking further away from the life I thought I knew, and deeper into a truth that would change everything forever. The sound of Anthony's car pulling into the driveway jolted me back to reality. I could hear the familiar rumble of his engine, the slam of the car door, his footsteps on the front porch. Panic seized me as I realized I was still sitting in the attic, holding evidence of his betrayal in my trembling hands. My first instinct was to hide the diary, to pretend I'd never found it, to go back to the blissful ignorance I'd been living in just an hour ago. But something deeper, stronger, kept me frozen in place. This was my life they'd been playing with, my trust they'd been abusing, my family they'd been lying to. I deserved to know the whole truth, no matter how much it hurt. I could hear Anthony calling my name from downstairs, his voice carrying that familiar warmth that had always made me feel safe and loved. Now it just sounded like another lie. "Laura, honey, I'm home. How's the attic project going?" His voice drifted up through the house, and I could picture him hanging his golf bag in the hall closet, probably whistling that little tune he always hummed when he was in a good mood. I wondered if he'd had a good game, if he'd beaten his usual foursome, if he'd stopped for a beer afterward like he sometimes did. These mundane thoughts felt surreal in the context of what I'd just discovered, like trying to have a normal conversation while the house was burning down around us. I clutched the diary tighter, my knuckles white against the dark leather. Part of me wanted to march downstairs and confront him immediately, to throw the diary at his feet and demand an explanation. But another part of me, the part that had been married to this man for 32 years, needed to understand the full scope of his deception before I could face him. I forced myself to turn the page, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the diary steady. The next entry was dated 3 months later, and Anthony's tone had shifted from guilt to something that looked almost like longing. Marcus started kindergarten today. Emma sent me a photo of him in his little uniform, backpack almost as big as he is. I wanted so badly to be there for his first day, to walk him to his classroom and take pictures like any father would. Instead, I had to pretend to be the caring uncle, had to act like my interest was casual and appropriate. Laura asked me why I seemed so invested in Marcus's education, and I made up some story about wanting to be a good role model. The lies come so easily now. It scares me. I'm becoming someone I don't recognize, someone who can look his wife in the eye and lie without flinching. The entries continued, each one revealing another layer of the elaborate deception that had been my life. Anthony wrote about school plays he'd attended in secret, about birthday presents he'd wanted to buy but couldn't without raising suspicion, about the agony of watching me bond with a child who was biologically his. He wrote about Emma's struggles as a single mother, how she'd sometimes call him late at night when Marcus was sick or having nightmares, how he'd wanted to rush over and help but had to maintain the pretense of being just a concerned brother-in-law. The picture that emerged was of 2 people trapped in a web of their own making, unable to escape the consequences of a moment of weakness that had created a human being who deserved better than to be someone's shameful secret. But what hurt the most were the entries about me. Anthony wrote about my excitement when Emma had announced her adoption plans, how I'd immediately started planning shopping trips for baby clothes and nursery furniture. He described my joy at becoming an aunt, how I'd thrown myself into the role with characteristic enthusiasm, never suspecting that I was actually celebrating my husband's betrayal. Laura bought Marcus a teddy bear today, one entry read. She was so excited, talking about how she wanted to be the kind of aunt who spoiled him rotten. I watched her wrap it with such care, such love, and I felt like the worst person who ever lived. She's giving her heart to this child, and she has no idea that he's a living reminder of my infidelity. How do I live with this? How do I watch her love him and know that I'm the reason she'll never have children of her own? That last line hit me like a physical blow, and I had to set the diary down as a wave of nausea washed over me. We'd tried for years to have children, had gone through test after test, treatment after treatment, only to be told that it just wasn't going to happen for us. I'd grieved the children we'd never have, had slowly come to terms with a different kind of life than the one I'd imagined. And all the while, Anthony had been watching me suffer, knowing that he'd already fathered a child, just not with me. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Not only had he betrayed me with my own sister, but he'd let me believe that our childlessness was just one of life's random disappointments, when in reality, he'd been experiencing fatherhood all along, just in secret. I could hear Anthony moving around downstairs, probably making himself a sandwich or grabbing a beer from the refrigerator. Normal Saturday afternoon sounds from a normal Saturday afternoon life that no longer existed. I thought about all the Saturday afternoons we'd spent together over the years. Lazy mornings in bed, trips to the farmer's market, quiet dinners at our favorite restaurant. Had he been thinking about Marcus during those times? Had he been comparing our quiet, childless life to the vibrant chaos of Emma's house, where his son was growing up without him? The questions multiplied in my mind like cancer cells, each one spawning two more, until I felt like I was drowning in doubt and suspicion. "Laura, everything okay up there?" Anthony's voice was closer now, and I could hear his footsteps on the stairs. He was coming up to check on me, probably wondering why I hadn't answered when he'd called my name. In a few seconds, he'd poke his head into the attic and see me sitting here with his diary in my hands, and then this strange, suspended moment would be over. I'd have to decide what to say, how to confront him, whether to pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen. But as I sat there in the fading afternoon light, surrounded by the detritus of our shared life, I realized that there was no going back. The woman who had climbed into this attic a few hours ago, the trusting wife, the devoted sister, the woman who believed in the fundamental goodness of the people she loved, that woman was gone forever. In her place sat someone harder, someone who had learned that love and betrayal could coexist in the same heart, someone who now understood that the people closest to you were capable of the deepest deceptions. "I'm fine," I called down, my voice sounding strangely normal, despite the chaos raging inside me. "Just got caught up in some old photo albums. I'll be down in a few minutes." The lie slipped out so easily, and I realized with a sick feeling that maybe deception was more contagious than I'd thought. Here I was, already learning to hide the truth, just like Anthony and Emma had been doing for 15 years. I heard his footsteps retreat, and I knew I'd bought myself a little more time. But time for what? To read more devastating revelations? To figure out how to confront him? To decide whether our marriage could survive this kind of betrayal? I turned back to the diary with trembling fingers, knowing that each page would take me further from any possibility of pretending this had never happened. The entries from Marcus's elementary school years painted a picture of a man torn between love and guilt, desperate to be part of his son's life, but terrified of the consequences of the truth coming out. Anthony wrote about attending school events from the back row, about volunteering to help with Emma's yard work just so he could spend time around Marcus, about the agony of watching other fathers teach their sons to ride bikes and throw baseballs while he had to maintain his distance. "Marcus asked me today why I don't have kids of my own," one entry read. He was sitting on my lap during Emma's birthday party, and he looked up at me with those serious dark eyes, my eyes, and asked if I was sad about not being a daddy. I told him that some people are meant to be uncles instead, and he seemed satisfied with that answer. But Laura was watching from across the room, and I could see the pain in her face. She thinks he was innocently reminding us of our childlessness, but I know the truth. He was asking his father why he can't acknowledge him. As Marcus grew older, the entries became more complex, filled with Anthony's growing fear that the boy would somehow figure out the truth on his own. He wrote about Marcus's resemblance to him becoming more pronounced with each passing year, about family members commenting on how much the boy looked like Anthony's side of the family. "Uncle Marcus looks just like you did at that age," his mother had apparently said at one family gathering, and Anthony had spent the rest of the evening in a cold sweat, waiting for someone to put the pieces together. He described the elaborate mental gymnastics he had to perform to explain away the similarities, the careful way he had to modulate his interest in Marcus's life so it seemed appropriate for an uncle, but not suspicious for a father. But it was the entries about Emma that truly broke my heart, not because I felt sorry for her, I was still too angry for that, but because they revealed the full scope of how my sister had been living with this secret. Anthony wrote about her struggles with dating, how she'd turned down several promising relationships because she couldn't bear the thought of explaining Marcus's true parentage to a potential partner. He described her financial difficulties as a single mother, how she'd been too proud to ask for help even when she was struggling to pay for Marcus's school supplies and sports equipment. "Emma called me crying tonight," one entry read. "Marcus needs new cleats for soccer, and she just doesn't have the money this month. I wanted to offer to pay for them, but how do I explain that level of investment in my nephew's athletic career? Instead, I had to listen to her worry about disappointing him, knowing that I could solve this problem with a simple trip to the sporting goods store." The picture that emerged was of 3 adults whose lives had been fundamentally shaped by one moment of weakness, one betrayal that had rippled out through the years like stones thrown into still water. But what about Marcus? What about the innocent child at the center of this web of lies? I thought about him as I knew him, a bright, funny kid who seemed well-adjusted despite growing up without a father figure. He called Anthony Uncle Tony and seemed to genuinely enjoy spending time with him, never suspecting that the man teaching him to change a tire or helping him with his math homework was actually his biological father. How would this revelation affect him? How do you tell a 15-year-old boy that his entire understanding of his family structure has been a carefully constructed lie? I flipped ahead in the diary, looking for more recent entries, and found one dated just 6 months ago that made my blood run cold. "Marcus is asking questions about his adoption," Anthony had written. "Emma called me in a panic yesterday because he'd been researching adoption records online for a school project about family history. He's starting to wonder why there are no official documents, why Emma can't tell him anything about his birth parents, why the adoption agency she claims to have used doesn't seem to exist. Emma is terrified that he's going to figure it out on his own, and honestly, so am I. He's smart enough to put the pieces together if he really starts digging. What happens then? Do we tell him the truth? Do we continue the lie and risk him finding out another way? I feel like we're sitting on a time bomb, and I don't know how to defuse it." The most recent entry was dated just 2 weeks ago, and Anthony's handwriting looked shaky, desperate. "I can't do this anymore. The guilt is killing me, and I think it's killing Emma too. Marcus deserves to know who his father is, and Laura deserves to know the truth about what I've done. I've been thinking about telling her everything, but every time I work up the courage, I look at her face and see how happy she is, how much she trusts me, and I lose my nerve. She loves Marcus like he's her own nephew, and she loves me like I'm the faithful husband she thinks I am. How do I destroy both of those relationships with one conversation? But keeping this secret is destroying me from the inside out. I'm not the man she married anymore. I'm a liar and a coward, and she deserves better than that." I closed the diary and sat in the growing darkness of the attic, my mind reeling with everything I'd learned. The man I'd been married to for 32 years had been living a double life, carrying the weight of this enormous secret while I'd gone about my days completely oblivious to the truth. But what struck me most was the genuine anguish in his words, the clear evidence that this deception had been torturing him as much as it was now torturing me. This wasn't the diary of a callous cheater who felt no remorse for his actions. This was the record of a man who had made a terrible mistake and then compounded it by choosing secrecy over honesty, who had spent 15 years paying the price for one moment of weakness. But understanding his pain didn't erase my own. If anything, it made it worse, because it meant that he'd known how much this would hurt me and had chosen to protect himself instead of trusting me with the truth. He'd made the decision for both of us that our marriage was too fragile to survive honesty, that I was too weak to handle the reality of what he'd done. And maybe he was right. Maybe I wouldn't have been able to forgive him 15 years ago. Maybe our marriage would have ended in divorce and bitter custody battles and fractured family relationships. But now I'd never know, because he'd taken that choice away from me. He decided that his version of protecting me was more important than my right to make my own decisions about my own life. I heard Anthony's footsteps on the stairs again, this time more purposeful, and I knew my time was up. "Laura, it's getting dark up there. Do you need help with anything?" His voice carried that note of gentle concern that had always made me feel cherished and protected. Now it just sounded like another manipulation, another way of controlling the narrative of our life together. I quickly closed the diary and shoved it behind one of the boxes, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he'd be able to hear it when he reached the attic. I grabbed a random photo album and opened it to a page of vacation pictures from our trip to Colorado 5 years ago, trying to look like I'd been innocently reminiscing instead of having my entire world destroyed by his hidden confessions. "I'm coming down now," I called, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. I stood up on shaking legs, brushing the dust off my jeans and trying to compose my face into something that resembled normalcy. How do you look at someone you've loved for 3 decades when you've just discovered they've been lying to you about something this fundamental? How do you make small talk about dinner plans when you've just learned that your nephew is actually your husband's secret son? I climbed down the attic ladder, each step feeling like I was descending into a different life, one where nothing was quite what it seemed and everyone I trusted was capable of elaborate deceptions. Anthony was waiting for me at the bottom of the ladder, and when I saw his face, those familiar brown eyes, the slight graying at his temples, the smile lines that I'd always found so attractive, I felt a wave of grief so intense it nearly knocked me over. This was the man I'd built my life with, the person I'd trusted with my deepest fears and greatest hopes, the one I'd planned to grow old with. But he was also a stranger, someone who had been carrying this enormous secret while we'd shared breakfast every morning and kissed goodnight every evening. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, like trying to hold 2 completely contradictory truths in my mind at the same time. "Find anything interesting up there?" he asked, reaching out to brush a cobweb from my hair. The gesture was so tender, so automatic, that for a moment I almost forgot what I'd discovered. This was the Anthony I knew, caring, attentive, always looking out for me in small ways. But then I remembered the diary, remembered the words he'd written about watching me love Marcus while knowing the truth about his parentage, and I had to step back from his touch. "Just old photos," I managed to say, holding up the album I'd grabbed. Amazing how much stuff we've accumulated over the years. The irony wasn't lost on me. We'd accumulated lies, secrets, and betrayals I was only now beginning to understand. "Well, I was thinking we could order pizza for dinner," Anthony said, seemingly oblivious to my internal turmoil. "Maybe watch that movie you've been wanting to see. Make it a nice, relaxing Saturday night." The normalcy of his suggestion felt surreal, like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. How could he talk about pizza and movies when there was this enormous elephant in the room? But then I realized that for him, there was no elephant. He had no idea I'd found his diary. No clue his carefully guarded secret was no longer secret. In his mind, we were still the same couple we'd been this morning, still living the same life we'd been living for 32 years. I couldn't sleep that night. Anthony lay beside me, breathing peacefully, completely unaware that his world was about to implode. I stared at the ceiling, replaying every family gathering, every interaction between him and Marcus, every moment when I should have seen the truth but didn't. By morning, I had made my decision. I was going to confront Emma first. She deserved the chance to explain herself before I destroyed Anthony. And maybe, just maybe, there was more to this story than what I'd read in those devastating diary entries. I waited until Anthony left for his Sunday morning run, then drove across town to Emma's house with shaking hands. Marcus answered the door, and seeing him standing there, Anthony's eyes, Anthony's stubborn cow lick, Anthony's gentle smile, nearly broke my resolve. "Hey, Aunt Laura. Mom's in the kitchen making pancakes. Want some?" His innocent enthusiasm was like a knife to my heart. The sweet boy had no idea that his entire world was built on a foundation of lies, that the uncle he adored was actually his father, that the aunt who loved him was about to shatter everything he thought he knew about his family. When I walked into Emma's kitchen and saw her face, I knew that she knew. Maybe it was something in my expression. Or maybe she'd been living with this guilt for so long that she'd always been waiting for this moment. "You found out," she said quietly, her hands trembling as she set down the spatula. "Laura, I can explain," but I held up my hand to stop her. "Not here," I said, glancing toward the living room where Marcus was watching cartoons. "Not in front of him. Because whatever happened next, whatever truths came out and whatever relationships were destroyed, that innocent boy deserved to be protected from the fallout as long as possible."